Hello, everyone. I hope you are having a wonderful weekend. Thanks for checking out my video. And as usual, I am back to share some more stuff that I have found about my SunBuddy, possibly your SunBuddy, and your SunBuddy too. I wanted to share some information I found about this issue that we are all having when we point our cameras at the sun. Now, initially, when I was taking these pictures at the beginning a few years ago, I had dismissed it as a flare, beautiful flare. And then I moved somewhere else and tried to capture the same shots, and they were not the same. And that drove me crazy because I needed to know why my camera was showing this weird flare. What was it? Was it a defect? So I tried it with a few of my other cameras, and across the board, from cell phone to professional camera, I was having some issues. But they weren't the same issues, and it wasn't the same dot. So I kept searching and somehow ended up with YouTube videos and some other websites that described it as being something different. So that drove me deeper down the rabbit hole, which is not always a good place to go. And I still couldn't find an answer that was satisfactory to me. So I started to ask some of the people who were claiming to know more things about the flares, and a lot of the people didn't even respond. So a lot of people were calling this, something that was extraterrestrial in nature. And I looked, and yeah, there were some possibilities of extraterrestrial type things, planets, aliens, if you believe that stuff. And of course, it's very amusing and entertaining to consider these things. But I wanted to look at more of an earthly level of possibilities. Because, yes, while there are things happening in outer space, some of them are wonderful, fantastic. Some of them are scary and dangerous. That also was not a satisfactory answer to me. I don't think it should be a satisfactory answer to any of us who are really trying to figure out what's going on. At the very least, doing the research for me has taught me a lot about science, has taught me a lot about astronomy, a little bit of astrology, and it's, in my opinion, something that has enhanced my learning ability as a photographer. So, let me share some stuff straight up. This is some stuff that I found online. It is possible, it is highly likely, that our phones are experiencing a sort of defect. Now, first let me tell you, lens flare, it's basically the image of light that is reflecting inside of your lens. So it's the type of lens flare you're going to get is highly dependent on the type of lens you're using and the light sources given in this picture that you're taking. Now, when it comes to our phones and the quick things that we use to run out and take pictures, it's possible that we all are having a similar effect or a defect of the similar nature because of the types of lenses that are being put on our cameras or the type of sensor that sits behind the lens on your camera. Now, in my previous video, I discussed Fresnel lenses and the powerful effect that they have. So when you are looking at something that has a light magnification ability, like a Fresnel lens, or perhaps the atmosphere and the sun, we may expose our cameras to a magnification effect, that has the ability to do multiple things and create a certain type of image. And that image is a defective image until you Photoshop whatever the issue is out of your picture. Now, our cameras, though we may purchase them from different companies, some of you have Android, some of us have iPhones, the modules inside have a similar design oftentimes, mainly because, they're for the same thing, taking a picture. So it would not be strange that a lot of our phones are seeing the same types of images to some degree. Now, for those of us who are taking pictures also with a still camera, or even a high-end video camera or a decent video camera, when you have light reflecting off several points or different surfaces, it can create multiple individual points of light or light sources. For example, where sunlight might be bouncing off water, vehicles, or other reflective surfaces, you may see this type of anomaly. So, like in this picture here with a car, you can see multiple flares as the sunlight bounces off the dents and the, weird parts of the hood of the car. Now the next image I'm showing you is what light looks like when it hits your camera, at least from the side. For those of you who are shooting from an angle and not pointing your cameras directly at the sun, which if you are, I hope you're not looking through the lens. Don't look through your camera. Hopefully your camera has a screen that you can look through, because you're going to go blind if you don't do that. So lens flare that you see here in this picture is the light you can see scattered. As it hits the lens system, it can produce an unwanted image formation. And this can be considered an internal reflection, also a scattering. And this comes from the material that can be used to coat your lens. Sometimes the creation of the lens itself, like I learned that previous iPhones, some of them, not all, had a sapphire type crystal lens on it. And that, if you could imagine a sapphire tinted crystallized lens, you could imagine you might get some fun colors, some fun stuff. Now, flares generally manifest themselves in two ways: as visible artifacts and or as a haze across your image. The haze can make your image look washed out by reducing the contrast and color saturation, like adding light to dark image areas or adding white saturated parts of your image, which would reduce their saturation. Visible artifacts, usually in the shape of the lens iris, are formed when light follows the pathway through your lens that contains one or more reflections from the lens surfaces. Flare is particularly caused by a very bright light source, okay? Now, this type of flaring usually can occur when you're shooting into the sun, or even when the sun is in the frame. It can also happen when your lens is just pointed in the direction of the sun, or a light that is really bright. Now, sometimes as photographers, we use a lens hood to deal with that. But if you're shooting your camera directly at the sun, you may still encounter these flares. Now, a secondary effect of flaring is, now this one can be widely distributed across the image and possibly not visible. This one is the haze, and it reduces the contrast, making your picture look white whitened up or washed out. Now, if you're using your zoom, you can get a bigger version of this lens flare. Now let's talk about spatial distribution. Now that can usually manifest as several starbursts, starry looking things, rings, or circles in a row across your image or view. Lens flare patterns typically spread widely across the scene and change location with the camera's movement relative to your light source. Now, this spatial distribution largely in part depends on the shape of your aperture and the formation of your lens. For example, some lenses have a 6-bladed aperture, so your flare may have a hexagonal pattern. Now, this type of scattering can also happen in your eye. And when you see it in your eye, it comes out as like a veiling glare. You can see this type of thing when you're looking at a very bright light late at night. Maybe your eyes are tired. Or at a really reflective surface that's got a light coming off of it. Alternatively, ladies, our eyelashes, or you guys who have really nice long eyelashes, you can get this flare too. Now, when you have bright light shining on the lens, but it's not in the field of view of the lens flare can often appear like a haze that washes out your image, okay? Again, you could try a hood or holding your hand over your camera phone lens when taking a picture if your sun's not in the shot, but you are experiencing an unwanted lens flare. Sometimes you can buy a filter for your camera, or you can buy little components that you can add on to the camera that may help. But again, if you're trying to capture pictures of the sun, you're just going to have to deal with some of the issues, or all of the issues, that come with exposing your camera to a light this bright. Now I want you to have a look at a lens flare being used for cinematography purposes. One of my favorite movies, Christine. You can see here the photographer or the videographer has made use of the lens flare coming off the car. You can see it's coming from the lights, but you've got this fire going on with the car. And so all of these things are pushing an extreme amount of light towards the camera. And this can create a lens flare. Now you're seeing the line across the lens flare because the camera that's being used is a very wide angled type of camera. So everything around the shot kind of stretches and curves. And we call this again an anamorphic lens. You may be able to find an app on your phone that can give you this type of image, and sometimes people's new phones may do the same thing. I know my iPhone has the ability to take that stretched out picture where you capture it and slowly turn so you can capture a wider image. Not speaking for anyone else, but on my iPhone, it's the panoramic option when you're taking a photo. So you take the picture and it puts a arrow across the screen, and you kind of have to follow the line across your image, and it captures this long, wide image. And even I haven't been able to perfect this, but it works well when it's a camera on a tripod. So if you like those, you could try that out. Now let's talk about a kind of flare that is specific to our digital cameras. When you have the sun shining on your unprotected lens, a group of small rainbows can appear, and that artifact is formed by an internal diffraction on the image sensor. Now that acts like a diffraction grate, or grating of some sort, kind of like a filter or a covering with holes in it. Now, unlike true lens flare, that artifact is not visible in the eyepiece of your camera, and you really probably won't see those until you upload them and expand them. Now, you can look at a lot of the NASA lunar landing photos as they exhibit lens flare, kind of like studio lights. I'm not saying anything else about that, but yeah. Now, besides the obvious flare that happens around the sun, light can also artifact at the bottom of an image, and that can also be a flare. Now, if you play video games, you've seen lens flares in some of the video games. And don't be mad. This stuff, not only can be created on your computer, but it's when you're photographing it in real time, it's really a difficult thing to control, okay? Because you don't control the sun. So be forgiving, and, if you're not trying to have that in your shot, you should not be pointing your camera at the sun. Again, you can hold your hand over your camera's lens to try to block out some of that. Or you can just move yourself and your subject to a different spot or try a different angle. I always say when you're taking pictures outside, what I do is I try to capture as many photos as I can in the shortest amount of time possible. For a myriad of reasons, which I'm going to go over in a minute, but you don't want to get sunburned, and you don't want people outside taking pictures in the sun, or even with the sun to your back if it's hot outside. Your subject is going to get tired. People get angry after a while when they're taking pictures in the sun. And the photographer also can get tired. And it's just not good to be standing out there pointing your camera at the sun. But it is a beautiful shot when you capture something that looks good to you, which is how I started all this. Now, as photographers, or at least as a lot of graphic artists, use something called bokeh. Bokeh. You can look this up. You see it in a lot of photos. It's a intentional manipulation of the light. And it looks like a bunch of circles, and they're out of focus, and there's a ton of colors. And a part of the creation of this has to do with the internal parts of your lens. When your lens has a bunch of different parts to it, or a bunch of different layers to it, you can create lots of different colors depending on your source of light. And all you have to do is focus out of your subject. You can see this pointing your camera at a light and focusing on an object away from your light while still holding the same shot towards your light. Your camera will fuzz out and you'll get a circle instead of a sharp object. Now you can get this type of circular fun stuff in cameras. You can get them in video cameras. You can even get them in telescopes. And a lot of our cameras have an anti-reflective coating that is generally and supposed to be used to reduce lens flares. But sometimes it can produce red, green colors, all types of stuff that you will see today in our lens flares. Now, here's an image of typical 35 millimeter camera, whether it's digital or not, but this is the lens. Okay, for those of you who are shooting with interchangeable lenses. Even the simplest camera has lenses that oftentimes comprises of several lens elements. Now, the lens flare can be caused by non-image light that does not pass or refract directly along its intended path, but instead reflects internally on the lens elements, however many there are, and they go back and forth before they finally reach your film or your digital sensor. Now, my lens on my Canon has several lens elements, and each lens element has some type of anti-reflective coating, and it's supposed to minimize flare, but I don't think they made them while pointing their lenses at the sun. So some of our light sources are still going to reflect a small fraction of their light, and the reflected light will be more visible as a flare in places where it becomes comparable in intensity to the refracted light. Now, flare can appear as polygonal shapes, and that is caused by light which reflects off the inside edges of the lens aperture. Now, those appear in a lot of my beginning images, and it just looked really cool, like some type of UFO or something. Now, flare can technically sometimes be caused by the internal reflections, and that comes because you're shooting it at something as bright as the sun, and the more you point your camera towards the sun, those flares get brighter and become more intense, and become oftentimes a subject of our photos. Now, sometimes you are not shooting at the sun, but the sun can still be flare-inducing. So you may get a flare in response on your image that isn't quite as strong, but is still pretty interesting. Now, sometimes you just get the stray light that can enter your lens from a artificial light, sunlight, sometimes even moonlight. And that in and of itself can still cause a flare of some sort, because this light still can enter your camera and travel in a way that you did not want and still reach your film sensor. So here I got a couple of breakdowns of what that can be like for your camera lens. And there are lenses of all types on our cameras. Some have a fixed focal length, or sometimes photographers call it a prime length, prime focus. And those can be less susceptible to lens flares than zoom lenses. Now, I happen to prefer zoom lenses because, you want to get close to stuff. So, yeah, I have to deal with the flares. And the longer my lens is, the more flares I'm going to get. Because naturally more components for the light to have to deal with. Wide angle lenses sometimes are more flare resistant to the bright light sources. And that's mostly because when those people were making those lenses, they knew that there'd be a greater field of view and that the sun may interfere. So you can alternatively try a wide angle lens if you're trying to eliminate your SunBuddy. Now, they say that the more expensive your lens, the less likely it is that you're going to deal with these flares, because they're going to have better anti-reflective coating. I don't agree with that. I think that at least right now, the sun that we're looking at, seems or at least feels a lot stronger. So maybe maybe the coating isn't up to date, up to par with what we're trying to capture. Now, having said all that fun stuff, let's talk about our phones in specific. Very, very specifically speaking. Your phone, my phone, our phones, may be experiencing a defect. You may want to go look this up. I put some links down at the bottom under the video in the description so you guys can go look. You may want to check out this stuff. Some phones, primarily our newer ones that have 2 cameras, might be able to see light from one side of the camera through to the other, which may create some of these artifacts that we're looking at. When lens flare occurs in those cameras or in our cameras, the light path of the flare can reflect off of one or more of the components of the camera, which can create an appearance of a solid object. So my advice is maybe get your phone in someone else's phone or block or put a piece of tape over the other lens that you're not using when you take your picture and see if that helps. I don't know if it is because I haven't tried it yet, but that may be something you might want to test out for yourself and see if that improves your images. Now, for those of us that are curious about our green or purple or fun-colored SunBuddy, possibly this could eliminate it. Maybe not. Now, what I found when I went to do some research on the defects that are possible with the cameras, I discovered that it wasn't just an iPhone issue, that this is happening to Androids also. And some of the Android users are seeing a smudge, they're seeing purple stuff. My camera is seeing a white dot that never moves away from the light source. And it looks like a very stationary thing. So I nicknamed it the SunBuddy because I was only really seeing that when I pointed my camera towards the sun. So my suggestion is go inside and have a look at these pictures. Look through your camera phone at a bright light in a dark room and see if you can recreate this effect indoors. And if you're able to recreate this effect indoors, then it is highly likely that your SunBuddy is a defect or an artifacting that has to do with the lens or your sensor. Or alternatively, worst case scenario, your sensor may be burned. And what we are not being told is that our cameras cannot handle the heat. And not just the heat of pointing your camera at the sun, but your camera being exposed to higher temperatures by leaving it in your car, leaving it in your purse while you're sitting in the sun. Just a lot of things we don't realize that we're doing. These things can heat up the internal parts or even melt oil, melt stuff that can leak onto the lens. I didn't even know this. Some of this stuff can leak onto your lens and create a smudge, which might explain the smudgy images that you may be getting in your Samsung phones, maybe even on the iPhones. So I have tried cleaning my lenses a lot, and I still get the same dot. So is it possible that some of the components of my camera are having this defect on the inside? Sure. So I went inside, and I went into my kitchen where my brightest lights exist, and I messed around with my lights, and you can see some of the defects, the lens flaring, the multiplication that's happening. Now, another thing to consider when you are pointing your camera at the sun, if you're still going to do it, and capture some of the pretty pictures, because they are some really nice shots. If you can get your camera focused correctly and you're fast about it, I think there are some absolutely phenomenal photos. I'm not going to stop doing it because I think they're beautiful. And they make screensavers that people will stop and ask you about, and you can conversate about your journey with the SunBuddy and how you came to produce such brilliant images. They're just gorgeous. I'm still in love with the pictures. I'm sorry that I paid so much money for a phone that is causing this problem, because before, at least for me, before I turned in my iPhone 4, which I really miss that phone, and then I upgraded to a 6 thinking I was getting with it, it wasn't until then that I started having these crazy issues. So that makes me sad. Something to keep in mind, though, when we're pointing our camera at the sun is that that bright light does have the ability to damage inside parts of our cameras, not just our cell phones, but our digital cameras. Now remember, do not forget, it's cool, it's pretty, but when you're taking direct pictures of the sun, this can destroy your camera. I won't even mention your eyes, because hopefully you're not doing that. So whether you are thinking of it as such or not, but if you're going to hop out there and take your pictures, please regard your lens the way you would regard a magnifying glass. Okay? And if you were going to hold a magnifying glass up to the sun and look through it, you are going to get burned. You're going to feel the heat quickly. You're going to jump out of the way, all that stuff. But in this situation, you have your camera as a blocking. So you're not going to feel how hot that light becomes because you got your camera in the way. Okay? So if you're going to do this, do it quickly, and I mean quick. When I'm out there, I'm as quick as I can humanly be while standing out in the sun. Do not just sit your camera up and point it at the sky. Okay? Don't do that. I would personally say, 30 seconds, 15 seconds of shooting and stop, and then feel how hot your camera has become. And if it's really hot, if it's warmer than normal, stop. Stop what you're doing. That's not a good thing. And this, needless, I shouldn't have to say after saying that, but if you were holding a magnifying glass at your skin, as long as you were holding your camera towards the sun, when you were done, you would, probably have a hole burn through your hand or your arm or your skin. And, you wouldn't do it. You wouldn't do it for that long. So if you're going to hop out and take these pictures, please regard your camera exactly the way you would regard a magnifying glass. And though you may want to look through the magnifying glass, you're aware that you're going to burn something. And I'm sure as kids, we've all held a magnifying glass over something and burned a piece of paper. Maybe you didn't. Maybe it's just my crazy behind. But I've done that before, and yes, it burns. It burns. So please keep that in mind. Just a little detail there for you. Now, for all of you out there who just acquired a 35mm camera and you want to hop out and capture these pictures, that advice is even stronger for you. Magnifying glass. Think magnifying glass. And for your camera defects, once you do capture your images, you are going to probably see some hexagonal stuff. And please have a look on Google, look into it and find out what the inside components of your lens and your sensor look like. Okay? You also have a little screen that lifts up and down, a little mirror, and that also has the ability to make some fun shapes in your images. You have something inside of your camera called it's called an aperture, and it has these blades. Some cameras have 3 of these blades, some cameras have 6 of these blades, and those things contribute to some of the hexagonal shapes that you see. In certain cameras, it can increase a star effect, and it gives you the flares that you see that come out of your star image. And sometimes you'll see 6, sometimes you'll see 12, and those numbers of the star rays depend upon the aperture and how many blades you have inside your camera. So you may want to look into that. Now, for those of you who discover you have an odd number of blades, your star may have double the points and may not add up well. And that's because the diffraction through your camera runs in both directions. And where the blades meet, there's a corner which results in something called a Fraunhofer diffraction. You want to look that up? Fraunhofer. Fraunhofer diffraction. Now that is where your edges and not the corners are responsible for those extra star lines. So, I hope that gave you guys some information as well as a good stern warning about pointing our cameras at the sun and the damage that we can do. For me personally, my Canon is my little fun camera, and pointing it at the sun isn't an issue for me. But if you just bought one, please be careful, because you may not even realize after a certain time that your camera has become burned on the inside. Here's a couple of pictures where you can see the type of melting damage that can be done if you expose your camera to too much sun. So please be careful. Those of you who are going to do time-lapse imagery or anything like that, or just stand out there in the sun and take pictures for extended periods of time, whether it's at the sun or the sun's in your shot and you're shooting a photo, a sports event, or anything like that. If you keep your camera pointed towards the sun, again, magnifying glass. And while you may not burn the sensor, or you may not burn the mirror or cause damage there, you can burn the framing. You can burn a lot of things, a lot of other components. Your lens are now going to have to deal with that. And while there's glass there, there are metal versus some plastic components of your camera and your lens that just aren't going to be able to handle the temperature of overexposure. So if you're out taking pictures at an event or anything like that, don't just hold your camera up at the sky waiting on a good shot. You know what I'm saying? Put your lens cap back on, or point your camera towards the ground so that you're not burning things up and not even aware. It can happen really fast. So again, consider the magnifying glass when you are taking outside shots where the sun is within frame, behind your back, any of that. Just take those things into account. And I hope that me putting this business out there doesn't offend too many people, because I know that, or at least I got an email or two that some people were not very pleased with some of my decisions, one of them in particular being to start debunking my images and some of the stuff that I see. But I really needed to take a earthly level perspective on this, because I just don't have that kind of time to keep staring at the sky. Like, I got to figure out what this is, because I want my pretty shots back. And how am I going to do that? I don't know how I'm going to do it now with my phone, because it seems pretty obvious that my phone has a defect of some sort. And just check out my links. Apple even acknowledges the error is there. And their response to the whole thing is just, hey, don't be pointing your camera in that direction. So, I guess that's a pretty basic and blunt answer, because they didn't intend for us to take pictures of the sun. They wanted to sell you a camera with a computer and a phone all in one. But it's certainly not created for sky photography, okay? So our decisions to use them for such leaves us vulnerable to a wide array of defects, errors, damage, emotional damage from trusting the image being provided to us. So we must be cautious about trusting images that are provided to us, especially when we are not going to consider the source in all of its parts. I'm glad this wasn't a multiple year journey for me. I'm sorry that it took this long, but I think I'm going to settle on this being a defect of the camera and a changing of components that are now creating this artifacting. I think it's happening to my phone, your phone, and any new cameras that we're getting now. Maybe they're cutting back on technology. Maybe, maybe it's not cost effective to put the older parts in that didn't give us this damage or didn't give us these images. Maybe they don't want to upgrade. They don't have to. They don't have to. So those of us here on the ground are just going to have to deal with it. And we're going to have to buy some filters or get some covering or get some solar filter sheets to hold over our cameras to capture better pictures of the sun. And we're going to have to look through our phones. And we're going to have to study their parts and components. And also, hop on some of these phone forums. There's an Android forum. There's an Apple forum. And this is where I found a lot of people complaining about the same issues I was having. And some people went out of their way to contact Apple. I even called the Apple store myself and tried to ask them about it, and they acted like they had no idea what I was talking about. But they were the ones who directed me to go to the Apple forums and see if anyone else had the issues and if they had been solved. So that, while I didn't get an answer verbally that I wanted, I got a better idea of the big picture. And some people have gotten their phones exchanged depending on how bad the issue is. And other people have just decided to deal with it and complain and bitch and moan. I guess I'm bitching and moaning because I really want to take my nice pictures and I'm sad. But maybe there's some fun stuff we can do with those flares. Hopefully, we can figure out for ourselves individually what this is and maybe not be so petrified about what it could or couldn't be. I ain't speaking to nobody in particular, so nobody send me any nasty emails. You don't need to make fun of people or crack jokes or any of that. I think it's just a beautiful thing that we have the ability to see something and then go learn what it is and answer questions for ourselves, in addition to sometimes, possibly answering this question for others. Now, this defect, obviously, while it's happening to our phones, we now have to expand this into webcams or sky cams that are subject to dirt, wind, rain, and flares. And they have internal parts just like our cameras do. They have sensors just like ours do. And just because you make a camera that points at the sky doesn't mean that sucker isn't going to get damaged after a while. Okay? Doesn't mean that it's not subject to defect or weird reflections, refractions. Who knows? I don't own a Skycam. And I can tell you when I'm looking at a lot of the Skycam sites, this is a similar anomaly that we're all getting from stationary cameras to handheld cameras. So whose fault is it? I think it's our fault from pointing our cameras towards the sky like that, because when those people were making those cameras, they were not made for astrophotography. Except maybe the sky cams. Those dudes need a good talking to, okay? Because I think they should have something that maybe should be impervious to these errors so that we get a crystal clear picture. But then you look at telescopes and the big monster telescopes with the domes that are sitting on top of a hill. And even those are subject to sunburn of sorts. Even the streaking. So, yeah. I don't know if the SunBuddy journey has come to a full close, but I do believe we can take some of the party favors down off the wall and, we can start looking at other things that are happening in the sky that are crazy and fantastic and scary. One of those scary things is climate change and what that's doing to the earth. And we can see that in pictures. Yeah, we could share those pictures. So I think I'm going to move on to some other topics. I'm still going to share some of the cool flares that I get, though, because I think they're just so pretty and they're so mysterious. And perhaps it's not something to be upset about, because this could be an awakening for us individually to look outside of ourselves and our own personal defects and take more care for the world. For those of us that thought that this was something extraterrestrial, it gave us an opportunity to look outside and not be so focused on our have-nots, Maybe it made you a bit closer to your family or your loved ones. Maybe it made you reach out and make new friends across the world and talk to people you had never spoken with before. Learn new things. Expand your mind. Expand your human being. I'm all about that. And if it took a fucking dot on the screen, if it took a crappy lens design to make friends and meet each and every one of you watching my video, then I'm not mad about it. It's a beautiful thing. And it was a great defect that adds to the imperfection of life. So I thank you guys for coming on the journey with me. It's been a beautiful one, but let's dig into some of these other topics happening around the world, because there's a lot going on. Let's take some more fun pictures. Let's embrace our humanity. We don't have to scam each other, and we don't have to live lies, because some of this stuff has answers. We may not have the answer for the reason that we're here, but if you ask me, I think it's all about the experience. I think individually we are part of a collective of experiences. So you guys take care. Be well. Be wise. And be you.